Building America's Wall, the cost and challenges of one of President Donald Trump's biggest campaign promises. This special series is the result of months of work by KPBS and inewsource. We dive into the data, why it's crucial to telling this story, and when politics inspires art, a look at the creative outlet for a debate filled with conflict. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Jean Guerrero, investigative reporter for KPBS News. Hi, Jean.
Hey, Mark.
Good to have you here today. Reporter Leo Castaneda of inewsource. Hi, Leo.
Hey, Mark.
Glad you're back with us today. Brendan Quester, Director of Data and Visuals at inewsource. Hi, Brendan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Glad you're here. And Kate Morrissey, who covers immigration for the San Diego Union Tribune. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Mark.
Glad you're back with us today. Well, it was candidate Donald Trump's mantra for over a year at political rallies. As president, he would build a big wall along the 2,000-mile southern border, and Mexico would pay for it. But we already have a wall in San Diego and in places along more than a quarter of the border. We're focusing today on that existing wall, America's Wall. Here's an excerpt from the series from KPBS News and inewsource, America's Wall.
Our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more.
The United States must secure its borders. This is a basic responsibility of a sovereign nation.
We have strengthened border security beyond what many believed was possible.
This isn't President Trump's wall. This is America's wall.
We're going to have strong, incredible borders. We're going to build a wall. It's going to be built.
As President Trump looks to build an impenetrable wall, so far only prototypes have been built. For now, his administration has scaled back plans to lengthen the border and instead plans to focus on rebuilding existing barriers, starting in San Diego. So KPBS and inewsource teamed up to examine those existing barriers, using what we believe is the most comprehensive data that's ever been released. We wanted to find out if the wall has been doing its job of reducing illegal immigration and drug trafficking. Using multiple Freedom of Information Act requests, we layered information about the wall's construction over time with other records. Our data shows a conspicuous pattern. Over time, America's Wall has reduced smuggling wherever it's been built. But it has shifted those flows into gaps between the barriers, into the ocean, into the sky, and even underground.
The purpose of border walls is to curtail illegal immigration and block the flow of drugs. Our series America's Wall looks at how well it works and whether a new, longer one will do better. So, Jean, start with a bit of an overview with that existing wall. What's it look like in various places? Where is it?
So there's no one way that it looks. It's kind of a hodgepodge of various types of materials, different barriers like corrugated steel, metal columns, Vietnam War helicopter landing mats even, which is what we see here in San Diego. It's 653 miles of sort of discontinuous barriers, and that's what our data allowed us to visualize exactly where it was and what the different barriers were supposed to do.
All right. And tell us a little bit about the America's Wall series. What was the purpose behind it? How does it tell the story? After all, this border wall and the border itself has been covered extensively by news outlets around the world. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, it started sort of as a curiosity that I had, starting with President Trump talking about his wall during the campaign in 2015. As we know, there's already a wall here, and so I wanted to find out exactly where there is a wall, what it looks like. And initially, Customs and Border Protection was refused to release any information, saying that it was a national security concern. If they released this information, they couldn't say exactly where the barriers were. So that's how I got involved with inewsource and Leo in trying to submit a Freedom of Information Act request that asked. We worded it in a way that ended up getting a really detailed response, and that's something that no other news organization had gotten, this massive file showing not only exactly where the wall is, but the date of construction for every stretch of fencing. And the date of construction was key because it allowed us to layer that information with things like illegal immigration, the construction of illegal tunnels. And so by making correlations between these different factors, we were able to ask the question and try to answer the question, have these barriers been effective?
Mm-hmm. Now, Leah, your inewsource team put a lot of effort into collecting and visualizing this data that Gene is talking about here. Rich trove of information through these FOIA requests. Tell us why this data is so relevant to people here in San Diego County and the Imperial Counties.
Well, like Gene said, it really lets us see when what is there was built, which is really interesting because I think, especially in San Diego, where the border and the border wall, by extension, is such a presence in our minds, it really let us understand how it's not something that's necessarily been here always. A lot of this wall, even in San Diego, has only been around for the last 10, 12 years. And I think that's something that lets us understand, even living here and in El Centro and Imperial County, that this is a shifting and evolving wall that is, strengthening in a lot of ways over the last 12 years.
Okay. And Brandon, you did a lot of work in this series looking at specific types of barriers and how to present them to the audience in a clear and understandable way, which is a heck of a challenge. One reason this took a long time to pull together. Tell us what the visuals accompanying the stories on KPBS and inewsource websites. So what do they show about this existing border wall?
I think the real core component of what we were able to bring to the public essentially is an interactive map that we created where we plotted each piece of the type of fencing along the entire U.S.-Mexico border, and it allowed a user to click on a piece of that fencing and say, okay, this is primary vehicle fencing, and it was constructed in, say, 2009. So it really gave that kind of comprehensive look, but in addition to that, in a visual look and in an interactive way, but in addition, we layered that with apprehension data also over time. The earliest date on the map itself goes back to 1962, and it goes all the way to 2015. And so we were able to layer that data so we can look at apprehensions, say in 2005. Well, what fencing was built in 2005, and what was the impact of that fencing in that maybe particular sector, and how did that impact the flow of migration? And I think that's one of the more sophisticated ways that we visualize this project, but we also use basic data visualizations. One example is a great interactive that Leo created that showed the key points when one sector became the most popular point of entry for apprehensions, and where those intersection points kind of told the story of, as fencing is created here, it shifts migration into this other sector, and then it's kind of a reactive process of building fencing and increased enforcement from Border Patrol as well.
All right. Leo?
Yeah, which is something that I think people maybe have theorized or have used anecdotes to try to say, and it's something that we were able to take a really numbers-driven, analytical look at and say, is this true, and where has it gone? It hasn't just gone into vague deserts, it's gone into specific places in the country, and what are those places? Okay.
And Kate, you cover immigration and smuggling, your beat at the Union Tribune. What's your impressions of readers' understanding of the existing wall and enforcement efforts generally?
They have a lot of questions. Immigration and border issues are so complex, and there's so many layers to how to look at them, and a lot of times, because of the access we're given and because a lot of things are, in these sort of national security vaults of the government where it's hard to get at some of that data, it can be very difficult to tell stories from that perspective. A lot of times we're reduced to anecdotal stories because that's what we have the easiest access to. So anytime we're able to get our hands on data and look at something from that perspective, I think it's always really helpful for readers.
Okay, and helpful for reporters and researchers and everybody else who wants to look at this issue, is interested in diving deeply. So I wanted to ask you and Gene, Kate, about factors that motivate people to cross illegally. What are some of the factors, and is the wall a big deterrent in terms of the reasons people come?
So based on the people I've spoken with, I think those factors have changed over time. When you look historically, a lot of it was economically motivated. People were coming to find jobs and send money back to Mexico. And when you look at the apprehension numbers and where people are coming from, and when you talk to people who study migration, that's definitely trending downward. Mexico's economy is stronger than it used to be, especially when the U.S. hit the recession. Our economy got weaker, and the risk versus reward changed. Right, but you also are seeing a great increase in people who are fleeing violence in Central American countries, and that's a very different motivator from I want a job. And with some of the different allegations that we reported on earlier this year, and I think we've discussed before about asylum seekers not necessarily being accepted at ports of entry, and there's some different complaints that have been filed with DHS offices about that. Some of them are then trying to cross over barriers instead, and so I don't know that that's likely to change if they're fleeing some of these really horrific violences back home.
All right, we do have a bite from President Trump here, and of course, as we said at the outset, made a huge issue of this in last year's campaign. He still needs proper funding for the border wall. It can only come from Congress. Here's some comments he's made in recent months, first at campaign rally in Arizona, and about as part of the DACA, the Dreamers Act extension.
And we are building a wall on the southern border, which is absolutely necessary. Build that wall. Now, the obstructionist Democrats would like us not to do it, but believe me, if we have to close down our government, we're building that wall. We have a very, very good relationship with a lot of people. A lot of people want this to happen. They expect it to happen, and we'll see if it happens. But we'll only do it if we get extreme security, if we get not only surveillance, but everything that goes along with surveillance. And ultimately, we have to have the wall. If we don't have the wall, we're doing nothing.
All right, so how much is the estimates of what this wall will cost, Gene, and what's Congress done so far about it?
So the estimates vary drastically. The most, I guess, reliable estimate that we were able to look at was that it's going to cost more than $20 billion. Depending on how much is built, which could be anywhere between 50 miles and 200 miles. The Trump administration hasn't been very clear in terms of what the plans are. Currently, they're focusing on rebuilding the fence, so the cost is expected to vary just depending on those factors.
And Brandon, I wanted to ask you, we're talking about, as Gene says, some segments, most segments. The whole border, though, as we said, is almost 2,000 miles. And how much of it are there walls of various types along that whole stretch?
Based on the data analysis that we did, it's about 653 miles of fencing that kind of separates the two countries. But there are vast swaths of land, in particular a lot in Texas, that are open. But what that doesn't always account for are the geographical barriers that exist now. You know, you have mountains, you have streams, you have rivers. So it's tricky to say how much is actually covered too, because you can look at a piece of fencing and it'll go perpendicular to the border, but sometimes that fencing goes into the country as well. And so the precise nature of exact mileage was a tricky one that we had a lot of discussions as we were looking at the map and as we were trying to determine a precise distance of mileage. But by and large, there are large swaths of land that are unfenced.
And it's rough, so it'll be roughly about a third of the existing border has some sort of fencing, as we've described going along here. One other point I wanted to make was Trump certainly isn't the first president to bring up a border wall here. And you wrote in your story, Gene, about 3 different presidents, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, who built sections of this wall relatively recently. Tell us a bit about that.
Exactly. So about 97% of the wall that we currently have was built under the Obama, Clinton, and Bush administrations.
George W. Bush.
George W. Bush. And about 90% was built after 2005 when the Real ID Act was passed, which allowed the the Department of Homeland Security to bypass environmental and cultural protection laws in order to build fence quickly. And so what we saw is after 2005, a massive increase in border fence construction. And so a majority of what we have is fairly new.
Okay. Leo?
Yeah, and what's interesting, too, one of the things that we saw with Clinton is that he started using double fencing and even triple fencing, which is something that I think we're going to start to see a lot more of. There's not a ton of that now, but it's a very imposing way to build a border.
Okay. Now, Trump has notoriously overstated border problems. He earned a pants-on-fire rating from Politico for saying at a rally last year that Hillary Clinton, quote, wants to let people just pour in. You could have 650 million people pour in. We do nothing about it. Think of it. That's what could happen. Triple the size of your country in a week. yeah, think of that. I mean, it's a ridiculous statement on its face. But in fact, Gene, we've seen a net outflow of people. It's surprising this even became a big issue in last year's campaign based on the numbers, right?
That's right. I mean, what we've seen as the Mexican economy has gotten better and more job opportunities over the past few years is a real sort of stabilization in terms of the illegal immigration coming from Mexico. So that's definitely that was a surprising thing when the wall became sort of this massive aspect of the campaign, because we are seeing very, very slow illegal immigration from Mexico.
The numbers don't really back that up. I have another bite I want to get to from the series here, Operation Gatekeeper under President Bill Clinton had unintended consequences. You profiled several people, including self-described vigilante Bob Maupin, I think I'm saying that right, lives near the border, regularly patrols. Here's a portion of his story.
I consider myself an American citizen. Most people don't anymore. I love my country. I believe in the Constitution. It is my duty to protect my country from people invading it. I'm going to die, and I don't care how, except I'm not going to die a slobbering old man in a rest home pushing a walker. I'm going out in a firefight.
All right, so that's dramatic stuff there. And what did George W. Bush, what did his administration do to respond for calls for border security after 9/11?
So the Secure Fence Act was passed in 2006, and that called for hundreds of new miles of fencing. So that was that was the most dramatic increase in fencing that we saw over those 2008 and 2009 were the biggest years of fencing construction.
Okay, I wanted to ask the inewsource folks, you got a lot of information here, as we say, a lot of stuff to go through and all, but what are some of the questions that you weren't able to get to, Brandon? Yeah, Leo, start with that.
Well, I think the biggest question and the issue that we grappled with a lot is that we know what's there, we don't know what's not there, which is kind of a philosophical question, but we don't know when a lot of that construction was that replacing, someone's chain link fence that they put up to keep, Mexican cows from eating their corn, or was there just nothing there before? So that's one of the questions that we weren't able to answer with that data that really tells us the historical look. We know in a lot of places there was nothing because we've talked, Gene talked to people who said there was nothing here. There's places where we know that there was some fencing, especially in San Diego, certain parts we know that there was fencing in the early 2000s or 90s, but we just don't know.
Right. Yeah, and that was really a difficult question to answer. The data that we had available that is presented in the map is of today's wall. And we have to say that with the caveat that of today's existing wall, at least going back to 1962, this is what we know was constructed and when. I know, for example, years ago I used to report in the southern border in Arizona, and there were large sections that were chain link fence, and now those are, considered primary fencing areas. So there has been a change, but that is what we can answer, is what was there prior to that and to what extent was it there.
All right, and Gene, I wanted to get at the idea of the wall as a deterrent. You reported that the numbers have dropped significantly, dramatically in some instances when walls and barriers go up, but people do find a way around, under, over. Tell us about that.
That's right, and that's what that was a big part of the story that we wrote. This significant rerouting that we saw in terms of illegal immigration and some forms of drug trafficking, smuggling in general. Wherever the wall goes up, you definitely see a decrease, and the value of that is something that is argued for. I interviewed Border Patrol, and they say that before the wall was built, it was impossible to do their jobs. We saw massive flows of people coming into San Diego from Tijuana, and so it's really stabilized the region and allowed huge shopping centers to go up right at the border, and these very affluent neighborhoods right at the border. But at the same time, we saw this very dramatic shift both into the desert, into the ocean. We saw maritime apprehensions go up dramatically, 74% during the main year of border fence construction. Also, underground, and then most recently we're seeing apprehensions of drones carrying.
And don't a lot of the folks who wind up here as undocumented immigrants actually come by airplane, which obviously a wall wouldn't affect, and overstay visas and things like that?
Yeah, so there is a significant percentage that come with visa overstays rather than crossing a border without permission. And there's sort of interesting different legal ramifications that happen to you depending on which one you do, because crossing the border has been criminalized as sort of a federal offense. You can get a misdemeanor or a felony depending on how many times you do it. But visa overstay doesn't have that same ramification at this point. There's some debate about that. But
all right. Well, it is a terrific series, and I recommend everyone take a look on KPBS or the inewsource website. We're going to go on to a related story here involving Kate this week. As politics plays out in Washington and elsewhere, art always looms to add perspective, emotion, and often commentary. So it is with the hot issues of immigration and border walls. Those issues were at the heart of an artistic competition at the San Diego Institute of Art. And Kate, tell us first of all about the two artists involved and the idea behind this particular piece of performance art.
Yeah, so they started with a blank 16-foot wall, two artists, Hugo Crosthwaite and Jose Hugo Sanchez. Both of them grew up in the border region. I believe they were both born in Tijuana, but they've crossed back and forth many times.
As so many people do. Right.
And so they were doing this sort of combat dialogue duel thing. It had a lot of layers to it, where one started at one end of the wall and one started at the other end. And they freestyled their images. It was completely improvised. They weren't allowed to come in with any sketches, any projections, anything, just, what they were feeling and thinking about. And as they worked through it, one of the things that they were meditating on was this idea of the border and the ways that that's influenced them and the ways that that's influenced other people who they had conversations with as the week progressed.
All right, now set the scene for us. You wrote that the artists encouraged people to talk with them as they started this whole creative process, and it went over a few days, right?
Yes, it started on Tuesday and ended on Saturday, so they were working most of the day, every day, and sometimes erasing what they did and redoing different sections, and people were encouraged to come in and talk to them through that process. They wanted the process of the mural to really be the art that was featured rather than, oh, look at our finished mural, which tends to be how we interact with murals, right, is when they're finished. And so this was a very different way of looking at muralism and having conversations, and then that influences your improvisation as you go to your next part.
Well, how did they go? Did somebody say, well, why don't you put a skull and crossbones here, or why don't you draw a flower here?
I think it was a little more philosophical. As I was listening to Sanchez particularly have some conversations, I heard snippets about Foucault and Heidegger and all kinds of people, so it was pretty varied in the things that they were talking about.
And how did the artists work with each other? Did they kind of go back and add something or subtract something from each other's work?
Yeah, so they, over the course of the week, went to each other's side of the wall. Well, they met in the middle, obviously, but then also they would...
It's kind of the intercontinental trains or cross-continental trains where they meet in the middle.
Right, but they also, at different points, would go to each other's side. So, for example, on Hugo Crosthwaite's side, there was a woman, and he hadn't finished her legs, and so Jose Hugo went over and made her legs sort of become a monster that had, like, several other things going on with it.
Okay, and how did the artists explain to you the ideas that they were trying to convey as they went along?
So there were quite a few layers to that. One of the really interesting points from Sanchez was this idea of meditating on power and the normalization of power that happens. And so he had a really wide variety of images on his part, everything from very like indigenous influenced imagery to like Mickey Mouse was up there, and then there were these sort of different monsters, like I said, that were a part of the mural. And then Crosthwaite talked about how the monsters for him were sort of representative of this stereotyping that's been happening when you talk about Trump calling Mexicans rapists and all this stuff. And so he was sort of meditating on some of that stereotyping. And what I found really interesting was there was this creature in the middle of the mural who he looked kind of like a monster, like he had fangs and was sort of like scary looking in some of the features that he had, but he was sort of cowering in the middle of the mural rather than attacking something. And so I think the mural left a lot of really sort of ambiguous pieces to it where you had to decide what it was or what it meant. I don't think the artists were trying to answer this issue. I think they were trying to ask a lot of questions. And
engage people and the viewers as it go along. Okay, a few seconds left. Tell us again where this is and where people can see it and how long is it going to be there? How much chance do you have to see it?
Sure, it's at the San Diego Art Institute, which is in Balboa Park. And it runs through January 7th, and they're open Tuesday through Saturdays. I think they're closed Mondays. Don't make the mistake that I did and try to go on a Monday to see it again. And it's not that expensive to get in. I think Tuesdays it's free for San Diego residents.
All right, very good. Well, I hope a lot of people get out and see that and are engaged by it. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guest, Jean Guerrero of KPBS News, Leo Castaneda of inewsource, Brandon Quester, also of inewsource, and Kate Morrissey of the San Diego Union Tribune. Reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.